Welcome to another episode of Money for Nothing, the podcast about music and capitalism. I'm Saxon Baird, and today you'll be hearing an interview that Sam did with Monia Ali. Monia writes the Fandom Exile Substack, which you can find at exiledfan.substack.com. The Substack really dives into like a deep dive spiral into the culture and like business practices behind fandom, that I think that when we use the term fandom, or we think about what a fan is, or even the difference between a fan or a stan, which to be honest with you, I didn't understand or know, this Substack and Monia's work just really takes it to the deeper level than the inner workings of what's going on behind, say something like Taylor Swift's success, or the success behind emo bandom, which is another term in which I was unfamiliar with until this interview. The work on her Substack and this interview just really touches on so many things that we like to discuss and dive into here at Money for Nothing. As usual, please rate and review us. Also, subscribe to our own Substack. We're dropping newsletters every week now, and sometimes we're touching on things that you don't hear in our podcast shows. So be sure to sign up at moneyfornothing.substack.com. That's the number 4. Okay, here's Sam's interview with Monia Ali of Fandom Exile Substack. Enjoy.
So much for coming on Money for Nothing. So I'm going to start off like with an incredibly broad and potentially stupid question, which is, when we're talking about fandom in this context, what are we talking about exactly? What is your working definition of fandom?
Ooh, that is actually a super tough question, because industry has a different definition of fandom than maybe fans do. Industry tends to look at it as anyone who spends money on their brand, or their artist, but I like to think of it as brands because that's more what we're seeing these days. It's less about the music itself and more about, the icon. Whereas fans will think of it more as the community that they form around a musician or a show, or anything really. Anything can have a group of people that share that affect, and just like unite and talk about it and create infrastructure to celebrate it, whether they're creating graphics or fan videos, fan-made trailers for movies and stuff like that. That's all fandom. There's the fan fiction communities. So there's all sorts of different parts of it. And industry is a lot more interested in the things that benefit them, obviously. So they try to steer people in that direction. But they include things like update accounts. They're pretty prominent on Twitter/X, and like Tumblr and Instagram. And it's these accounts that follow a specific brand just nonstop and gives you like, oh, they're currently in Los Angeles. Here are these photos. Oh, we've found that they licensed, like this song has been registered on BMI.
Yeah, it's like a mix between paparazzi and like close industry analysis, which is with totally no sense that those are different things.
Yeah, no, exactly.
And so we're also for your project, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that definition of fandom is pretty capacious. But I think that a lot of the having read your work, like a lot of the fan practices you're talking about are fairly internet centric. It's like a specific quadrant of fan world, like Knicks fandom or like Red Sox fandom is a fandom by that definition, though a fandom that operates in somewhat different ways than a lot of the fandoms that you focus on.
Yes. I think that's just because I don't have the same familiarity with those types of sports fandoms, but I do include them very much in what I'm looking at. And gaming fandom is another one that we're seeing tactics that they're using with their fans being adopted by music industry, like the whole thing with gaming whales. that are the people that spend a shit ton of money on a product or like a specific game, and they carry it for all the casual fans. And that's kind of
They
what,
carry it for all the casual. Can you explain what that means?
yeah, like it's like one person will be spending, and this is what you see when you read the literature as well, why they're so focused on the super fan. And super fan is usually seen as the person who is spending like 80% more than anyone else. They're considered, I feel like what's the most interesting is that there's different definitions depending on who you ask. Like there was a Luminate report for 2023, and they were saying like 15% of all Spotify users are super fans, and we define super fans as people who have 5 different touch points with an artist, or they're the ones that listen X amount of minutes. And then these are the ones that spend X amount of money. Like as soon as you reach a threshold, you're considered a super fan as per their metrics, and then they want to keep you there.
Which is fascinating because I mean, it's one of the things that we talk about a lot, which is the kind of general drift away from a variety of art forms, away from kind of the structure of mass consumption, where like you'd sell 2 million of a thing that cost $10, and that's where the money comes from, and pushing towards, on one side, like a much larger set of transactions and touch points that each give you a lot less money. And then oftentimes, if you think about like the VIP experience as the other way to get money out of this. What's interesting about this is that those super fans probably always existed and were always crucial for someone either who's a cult or like, I think about Prince. I assume that in the 80s, there were Prince super fans who both supported Prince financially disproportionately, as Prince is someone who's kind of on the border at times of a mass cult artist, but then also helped get like the ball rolling to get everyone else in America to sign off on one of our strangest all-time pop stars and his like many idiosyncratic both musical and like aesthetic trajectories. Like that those people were always there, but now we've got the analytics to notice them and reshape consumer economies or musical economies around them.
Yeah, I have a great example, which is the Kiss fan army.
Sure.
Yeah, so that was essentially created in 1975 by these 2 teenagers in Indiana who fell in love with Kiss from going to a concert, and they wanted their radio station to play them, and they sent a few letters, and the radio was like, we're not playing these guys. We're not playing them. But they were persistent, and sometimes they would play the song in the overnights, of course, and then they would get angry because it's like, you're not even saying who it's by. How can we expand their knowledge? Like, how can we expand the fan base? And the only time, like once this started taking off, is because there was a separate radio station that opened in the same market, and they realized that there was, oh, these Kiss fans want to hear it, so we can start playing it. And then the original radio station is like, oh, damn, now we have competition. We need to do something with these guys. So they staged a whole PR coup, which was like these guys were asked to send in aggressive fan mail that they would read on air to drum up excitement or like drum up publicity and like drama, which led to Kiss coming to town and having like a sold out show. And the information that I found suggests that they sold more than Elvis, but like I find it hard to trust a lot of these things, because if you look at the story of the Kiss Army, a lot of it is very mythological from Kiss themselves. They're like, yeah, there was 2,000 fans stormed the radio station and they sent them death threats, and it was a whole thing. And it's like, this was a PR stunt, guys. Like there was none of this actually happened. And one of the guys who started it was super excited to be like, oh, I can run this fan club for them. This is amazing. Except less than a year into it, their management was like, we're just going to take over this from you now, and we're going to make it a for-profit fan club. Yeah. So I feel like it lost a bit of it, and it ended up like collapsing at some point in the 80s and was revived in the early 2000s or so. So I feel like that was an example of them taking over and sort of like making it lose value, because the fans couldn't just connect with each other. They had to do it via this corporate entity. And that's what we see a lot today, I feel like.
Is no, and yeah, and that is something that we will absolutely talk about more generally, is the ways in which in a data heavy economy and a social media economy in which in an economy where you can get touch points, like a number of different touch points, where that's becoming clearly an increasingly large part of the music industry generally. Like, it's one of the reasons, just broadly framing why I'm so excited about this conversation, is because this does seem like a model that's becoming increasingly prevalent within the music industry writ large, and that almost everyone is trying to convert. If their listeners are not a fan base, they're trying to convert their listeners into a named fan base.
A name is very important. Absolutely. You need to have your little name for your group. And there's also the little fan pyramid that I'm sure predates this, but I first saw it in use in the work of Ben McConnell and Jackie Huba, who created the concept of customer evangelism in the 2000s. And they were basically saying, like, the 1% of your fan base is the fan base you need to be targeting, because they are the ones that will be the most invested in you and will be working the hardest for you. They will be promoting you, they'll be spending money, and they want to do it. They have a purpose that's bigger than themselves. I'm like, are you talking about a religion? Like, what? Like, you're describing something that's way more than just a customer. And those, yeah, they call them the customer evangelists. And the fan pyramids are seen throughout now. I think most people in this space are familiar with the 1,000 true fans concept. Right. That is no longer what people want. They want 100 true fans.
Just for listeners, 1,000 true fans is this idea that if you have 1,000 people who are willing to pay a medium level of income, that's enough to propel you to at least like semi-stability? Question mark?
Yeah, you can sort of keep, your business can run, like you can maintain. But I think that's part of the problem, is it's only focused on maintenance. And I think these types of attachments are not permanent. They come and go, and they're kind of cyclical. So it becomes hard if you're trying to maintain this insular community to just keep you going nonstop. Like, it's not really feasible.
And clearly there's going to be different levels of relationship. I mean, one of the things about 100 fandom is that that's a very small group of people, which means that the kinds of social dynamics are going to be different than the vast world of, let's say, Taylor Swift or Beyonce fandom or One Direction fandom, which is also different than the kind of more distributed, maybe, fandoms, I would imagine, of like kind of more traditional, when I think of like internet fandom, like Buffy fandom, where it's like clearly there's Buffy, but then there's like a number of para Buffy creators and then I assume fandoms of all of them. Okay, wait. So before we get too deep into any of these many fascinating avenues, I mean, I did want to just maybe frame this a little bit. If you can start by telling us just a little bit more about Fandom Exile, about your project, about like how you came to it and what you're trying to do with it, like what your perspective on fandom.
Yeah, I've been a fan since I was like 13. I've been active in fandom. So it's never been something weird to me. It's always just been a hobby. And I know that a lot of people in fandom were always very like, they were closeted fans, essentially. They're like, we don't talk about this. And I was always just like, I don't really care. It doesn't bother me. People know. But I still follow the rule of like, you don't necessarily talk about it with like media or publicly, in the sense that you don't want to expose the inner workings of fandom and the feelings of fans and all of that. And then I got sucked into a standom. I became a stan, and I didn't realize that there was a difference between just being a fan and being a stan until I was kind of exiled, which is where the name comes from, of the Substack. And that's when I started to ask questions about what was the difference between fandom and standom? What was so different about this experience? What does it mean that things have changed so much? Because part of the reason I started talking as well is because I realized that even if fans don't want to talk about fandom, other people will. There is always going to be journalists that are digging in. Like, there's monitoring of Tumblr. There's monitoring of Twitter fans. There's no fourth wall anymore. So I figured you know what? I might as well just start writing about it and try to give the fan perspective and look at the intersection of business and fandom, essentially.
Okay, so I have like a number of questions.
Yeah.
I mean, so one again, and I just want to like press on this a little bit more, because I just want to make sure, again, because I think that fandom, as we're discussing, it seems like it's both a set of structural conditions and then a set of communities and social practices that evolved within those structural conditions that have their own trajectories and evolutions and relationships to political economies and industries, etc. Because by both of your, I think, definitions, fandom, which is both someone who buys things and also someone who has a community of other people that you interact with about those things. Like, I was a fan of the band, like, NoFX in 7th grade, right? I bought NoFX stuff. I had NoFX t-shirts. I talked with my friends about NoFX. But you kind of gesture towards a set of rules, like a set of practices, and it just strikes me that while my engagement with the works of Fat Mike and Co. like count under your like very generous definitions of fandom, like it seems to me that we had a different set of social experiences and social practices related to those fandoms that seem meaningful. Like for instance, there was no rule that I couldn't talk about NoFX with other people. I wore NoFX stuff. I had NoFX written all over my like my shoes. Like I was a fan.
I know we didn't, well, Taylor is passé, but let's look at the fact that New York Times published a piece about how she's probably like she's hiding being gay.
One of the strangest pieces I've ever read.
So that is not an uncommon belief in fandoms for whichever fan object you're talking about. Like there's a belief that there's something that you know that the rest of the world doesn't know. It's like a secret between us, and you wouldn't go to the Times and be like, let me tell you about what we know about our person. Like that would just not be permissible, because that would be seen as like crossing, like you're breaking the trust between fellow fans and, you know, the fan object.
So there's something like a little bit conspiratorial in that it's a community based around a set of distributed revealed truths that like emerge. Its value as a truth emerges through the interactions around that truth, but like so in some ways it's a it's truth as an experience, not or a practice, not truth as a set of statements. Like this is like in Pierre Hadon, I think there's a French philosopher in the early 20th century. He writes about Greek philosophy, and he talks about how the Greeks have two different words for knowledge. Like one's like information, like data, and one's like wisdom, Sophia. And like wisdom has to be like, you can't just tell someone wisdom. They have to like go through a set of interactions that give them wisdom, and then that wisdom actually can't just be transmitted to someone else, because that's what you do with like information. That's what data does. And so like, but you can't transmit wisdom because they're different things. And his whole point was that like in Western society, we think those are the same thing, and they're totally not. And what strikes me about what your description of fan culture is like, there's knowledge that like, if the New York Times were just to print it, it wouldn't be the same as knowing in a fan community, it sounds like.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's a great way of describing it, because you're reminding me of what happened with emo bandom in the mid 2000s, which is like, you know, the umbrella term for, you know, Fall Out Boy, My Chemical Romance, Taking Back Sunday, and The Used, and Panic at the Disco, you know, all of those people, all of those bands. There were some solid LiveJournal communities, but once...
Oh yeah, those I was adjacent to.
Yeah, and a lot of them were locked, you know, so you would have to apply to become a member to get the access to the knowledge. And even this was already like a way too accessible for a lot of old school fans,
Right.
whose experience was you come to cons, you learn the norms, you become assimilated sounds like a weird word to use, but it's more like you would understand what the norms are and the social, like, the cultural, like what the culture is. But if you just go on LiveJournal and you can just find everything right away, then you're just appropriating what's there for yourself, right?
Right.
And when they sort of blew up in the mainstream, a lot of the old school fans sort of locked down everything because they were like, these are just people that don't know what we're doing. They don't know what we're about. And suddenly, I could be wrong, but I personally think a lot of the real person shipping, which is just a term for when people see two people and they're like, I want them to be together.
Mhm.
You want them to be in a relationship. Ship comes from that. A lot of that comes from that era because a lot of that was public and very accessible to the band members themselves and their management and everything. And they were like, oh, this is a great way to keep interest going. Like,
Right.
yeah, we'll make out on stage. Like, why not? And so it sort of blew up and became more mainstream. And the less gatekeeping there was, the more it was just this diffuse, this wide community. Like, you could barely say it was a community on its own. You would have different communities in different corners of the web. You might
Mhm.
have offline communities that didn't even ever interact with LiveJournal, but they would still be fans and they would still have their own fandom.
No, but that's really useful because I think it's and this is clearly an oversimplification in many ways. But I mean, one of the things that strikes me, when I encounter this type of fandom, which like general, and by this I'm gonna try to specify what I mean by this a little bit more. But like as someone who like considers myself a music fan, which is filtered through, and we've talked about this innumerable times on the podcast and various episodes about this kind of like how this idea of what a music listener, how that was constructed by through a specific set of racial and gender norms by a set of different, I mean, different visions of what a music fan is in different places, but like my experience as like a music fan with my own positionalities, like also through a specific set of critical communities that had like specific types of relationship, critical communities often that had relationships to print magazines with like music journalism as a major part in music criticism. So that's a whole set of like very specific historical processes that created my understanding of, music, what it meant to be a music fan, which is like a deep, complicated, equally specific and strange world, as all of these are. But I guess this seems like a very different set of. It's interesting reading your work and reading other stuff about fandoms around music, is that it's a very different set of social practices and social histories. And so I'm wondering, this seems like a total oversimplification, but it does seem like, so one, when you mentioned cons, right, that suggests like there's one genealogy that feeds into this practice is a fandom, which is like the convention style, I mean, broadly science fiction fandom, which is its own, goes back to what, the 30s, I think is the first con. This deep genealogy in 20th century American culture. And that's one trajectory. Are there any others that you would see feeding into this?
I mean, the thing is, a lot of it was happening independently of one another. There was a big rise of punk zines in the UK. I know about that from like in the 70s or so, I want to say.
Sure.
So that's also interesting to see how zines sort of came up kind of simultaneously in different places of the
Right. I mean, it's a set of technologies that are accessible to people, right? Like mimeograph, like there are Kinkos. Yeah, there are Kinkos everywhere, and it's a way to pre-internet. Yeah, it makes total sense.
Yeah, so I always feel like it's so human to relate to content and to I know the word content is ugly now, but I don't know how else to define it, to media, to something that means something to you and to interact with other people. It's so human that once those technologies come out, people try to use them to connect with one another. And yeah, the cons were one of the ways for the sci-fi fans. And then you have these zines, and obviously you have the deadheads that are traveling for shows and have their bootleg exchanges.
Which seems like it fed into it in the don't make freely distributed, don't make money from this ethos. That seems like a clear which is my understanding is a major part of like fan art and fan fiction, is like that is at least partially. I mean, I'd be interested to see if it was a parallel creation, but certainly from like a legal perspective, it does seem like the Deadheads figured out like as long as we're not making money from this, it's harder to sue us. Certainly, it makes you look less cool.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to know because I've found a few cases where I think Prince is one that tried to sue
Oh,
a fan
Prince
site.
famously, I mean, right before he passed away, um, claimed that he had like a crack team. He's like, I've got a team of 15 black female lawyers, and they will sue anyone who tries to pirate my stuff. You're like, God bless Prince. God bless. He's like very specific about who those lawyers were.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, you got it, I guess. I mean, there's, comics, anime, all of those, and
Right.
sports. Obviously, I think that's interesting reading about old school fandom. There was a report by a branding company from
Mm.
2016 that was doing like a big report on fandom, and they included sports fandom. And part of what they mentioned was it's passed on through the generations, right? Through your family, like your family is a Knicks fan, so you're going to be a Knicks fan. Like you take your kids, and it just becomes like this whole thing. So I think that's probably another way that this transfers. Or you go to school to a college that has a team,
Hmm.
and then you become associated with that team, and you just pick up those norms.
Yeah. And I mean, it's also, I mean, if we think about, and maybe this starts pointing us towards kind of my next question, which is how these sets of fandoms have started to interact with not just the music industry, which I think they have for a long time. And as you've pointed out in a variety of different ways, there's punk fandom, there's deadheaddom, there's, like the metal tape trading underground. Like that's how the guys from Metallica all met each other. They were like in the Bay Area metal tape trading community and came together that way. There's clearly rap fandom. I mean, for a very long time, but also like an act like Brockhampton came together on a Kanye West message board. Like many different fandoms. But it does seem to me to be something that's somewhat different in this contemporary moment. And again, I think maybe Taylor Swift is a good example of that. These practices of world building and this whole set of fan practices have become connected not to they're kind of traditional objects of attachment, sports fandom aside, maybe, which are like tend to be more cult things. Like not always, but like Buffy fandom more than Friends fandom, maybe as an example of like a classic '90s set of like where was the Star Trek fandom, right? Like more than initially Star Wars fandom, because like it's a cult, it's a different, specific, more selected community. And what seems to be different is that these fan practices are now tied to the biggest, most mainstream groups in the world, that they're really tied to pop music. In which case, I think that you probably have to bring in another set of both socially produced and industry mediated practices, which is around pop fandom, highly gendered, been gendered. I mean, I actually have a piece looking at like, among other things, like the very initial creation of female pop listenership in department store music counters in 1910, and the way that they're understood. But like, so there's this long tradition of, and then into movie magazines, into Bobby Soxers, into the Beatlemania, into, right? That there's this long socially transmitted practice of like teenage female fandom. That's a very specific set of social practices with their own cultural legitimacy and clearly a lucrative business model. But also one that seems different than those other fandoms that you've described, or at least at one point was more different than those other fandoms that you described, I think. That like Beatlemania was not as world, I mean, it was building a world, but it was building a different kind of world, maybe.
The way I've looked at it, or the way I think about it, is that this new modern type of fandom uses the tools of industry slash capitalism to measure
Mm-hmm.
the success slash their own standing in the world or in the world that they see, right?
Mhm.
And it obviously didn't start with this, but I can't help but think of, Lou Pearlman's tactic of I'm going to have Pepsi and I'm going to have Coke and I'm going to pit them against one another, which is NSYNC and Backstreet Boys, and I'm going to pit them against one another and I'm going to make all of the money.
Right.
But the fans are going to feel like they're championing their cause without thinking about the fact that all this money goes to the same person. Like none of this ultimately means anything, right? It's a constructed dichotomy that
How dare you say that about the Backstreet Boys?
they all had the same songwriters as well, right? So that's also that's partially
Yeah.
why I find Taylor Swift interesting, and other of those pop acts is, Max Martin is just has written for like all big pop acts, essentially. And he's now the has the most number ones on Billboard as a producer and is like number three as a songwriter.
And they all work with Jack Antonoff now, also. Like everyone.
And if not him, then there's a bunch of other, like Red One. I can't remember a few of the other ones, but there's a bunch of other producers that worked with Max Martin in that studio and like were trained and, have gone on and spread the Swedish gospel.
And that's really interesting, your point about like the Backstreet Boys versus NSYNC. I mean, I also think about American Idol as, right, you're voting for individual people, but everyone they're all in American Idol. Like, and the sense of voting as like part that interactivity.
Okay, so this is what's really interesting with American Idol. I did a deep dive into, I want to say it's season 10, when Adam Lambert and Chris Allen were contestants.
Right.
And a deep dive into that fandom. And it was really interesting to look at. So Chris Allen wins, and the fans are waiting with bated breath to be like, what label is he signing with? And then comes out like, oh, he's signing with Jive. And the fans are so angry. They're like, Jive is going to treat you poorly. Like, why would you do this? And then it's like, don't you realize that that's part of his American Idol contract? Like, he was never going to another label.
Right.
That's what you made him win. And now this is where he goes. Like, there's not really, there was this illusion that now he won, he has all this power, he can get whatever label he wants. And it's like, no, of course not.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And maybe we'll touch on this more later, but you've written about this, that there's this sense of like both, at some level, you compare it to professional wrestling, that there's this both like deep understanding of industry mechanics by the fans with a simultaneous refusal to accept that the whole thing is produced by an industry to make money. Okay, so if we take a couple steps back, maybe if we think, so we've got these different strands of fandom, which are all kind of percolating, and then maybe we just like throw them in the pot known as like the internet, which allows user-created content, which allows the proliferation of communities, which allows the endless dissection of what I'm going to go out on a limb and call minutia. And so you get all of this starting, and you get social media, and you get an increasing, and I think this is really important, the increasing centrality of online spaces for the construction of social identity writ large. That like, is this no longer a thing that you do outside of day-to-day life, that this is increasingly a huge part of everyone's day-to-day lives. Partially the smartphone means that like a part of going to a concert is that you share your experience of going to that concert, right? You're producing content about the content that everyone is a content producer. And so all of that is happening, let's say 2010 to 2014. I guess I wonder if you can pinpoint like specific artists or specific fandoms or specific moments that strike you as maybe not like causational or causative, but like indicative of this emergence of like a new model of fandom.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like part of it has to do with the LiveJournal era when Oh No They Didn't was massive because that was a big start of the crowdsourced.
I do not know. Oh no, they didn't.
Ooh, okay. Oh No They Didn't still I almost said was, but it's still it's still around. Um
Still on LiveJournal?
it's still on LiveJournal. It has nowhere near the pull that it had back then, but it is a gossip site that was crowdsourced. So you would submit news and you would have to source it, but you could post about whatever. So you would blend in everything. Like Pete Wentz would be there next to Nick Carter, next to a wrestling here, next to Metallica, next to sports fan, like just an endless stream. The Britney paparazzi era was very heavily documented on Oh No They Didn't. Perez Hilton would go
Yes.
to Oh No They Didn't. And, it was kind of like an alternative to Perez's I'm drawing dicks on people's faces. People didn't want that. So they're like, let's go to Oh No They Didn't, where
A wild period of American culture.
I feel like that was a big part of it because it's user generated, not to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I have no doubt that there were people working for celebrities that were submitting things, right? Just to amp up more attention and enter them into the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, probably with celebrity. I mean, I'm always struck when you read this stuff by like how late the music industry figured out any of these things. So it wouldn't surprise me if in the music industry context, like for bands or pop artists, that it all happened later than one might assume. Though by this is what, 2012, 2013, earlier?
Oh, this is like 2005.
Oh, right, because LiveJournal. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Actually, if you're mentioning the music industry, I can mention I found this information from these newspapers from 1999 about these marketing firms that worked to hype up Christina Aguilera on fan forums.
Okay.
So they would go to
please.
Britney forums and be like, "Hey, have you heard of this girl? She's so cool. I think she sings better than Britney." Like, just stir shit up a little bit.
I mean, true facts, but
Yeah, but it's also like
That's
Christina worked
effectively
with the same songwriters as Britney. Like, it's all this insular, I don't want to say it's meaningless, but it's kind of like a construct, right?
it can be both a construct and meaningful. We're postmodernists enough to be fine with that.
And it's but it wasn't widely used, I don't think, by any means. Like, it was very narrowly, probably the very, I was going to say avant-garde people, but that's probably not the right term. But there's probably executives that were more like, we can use this. And maybe the vast majority were like, we don't know what that is and we don't care. But it was still being used by some people, right?
Right. And so this is also like the crossover with celebrity culture, which is probably another strand of, I mean, yeah, thinking about the Britney paparazzi era, is a whole other set of
Insanity.
and practices.
Oh, yes. No, I was just going to say, if you look at Oh No They Didn't, you can start noticing the lack of fourth wall where some celebrities would find it and start interacting with it. And the members, there was a pretty famous event with Eli Roth, who found out that he had tons of fans on there and he would call them his blueberries. And he hooked up with a bunch of the girls from there. Like, if you look up Eli Roth blueberries, you'll find photos of his bare chest with like, "Hi, my blueberries, I love you." Like, it was a whole thing. So it had that it wasn't that it was a direct contact with the people they were talking about, but it's that it was public, right? So they had access to it just as everyone else did. And it was a different entry point into fandom for people. Like, I am not ashamed to say that I'm a massive Fall Out Boy fan. I love Fall Out Boy. I love the latest album.
No problem with it.
People didn't like the latest album, and I'm like, that's fine. It was for me. That's fine. But I didn't become a fan of them because I heard the music. I became a fan because I was reading Pete Wentz's interviews on Oh No They Didn't.
Sure.
And I was like, he seems like a cool guy. I should give this band's music a listen. And then I dragged my friends into it, being like, look at these amazing Q&A answers he had. Ooh, isn't this fun? And then, shift into My Chemical Romance and sort of spiral. The music ended up meaning a lot to me, but it wasn't the entry point.
I mean, I'm trying to think, and it strikes like the first musician I remember hearing about that was like fan base forward was Gaga, where like the first time I heard about it was like heard about her was like freshman year of college, so like 2007, 2008. And it was like, there's this girl from Long Island and her fans are insane.
And it's funny you should mention her because it was reading a book about her um relationship with her brand's relationship with her fans was the first time I discovered the term customer evangelist. Like they were using her as an example to show how this works, like how you target the 1% and get them to do a lot of the heavy lifting, because she had, I think, early adopter of having a community just for fans, right?
Yeah.
That had maybe 100,000 users, which seems like nothing, but these are dedicated diehard fans that will be doing a lot of your legwork. And that's super early in the days, right? Today, that would be like, yeah, of course, let's create a little platform. Let's create our, the National has their own little fan club online. Belle and Sebastian have their little fan club online. Like, it's just like all sorts of bands have that now.
So maybe that's a good transition point to think about, like, okay, so people start having these new complex set of relationships around artists that start pulling from different cultural vectors for fandom, or to change how fandom functions. Or you can just say like fandom evolves and these different things come together in different ways. There's a lot of different ways to describe that historical process. So, but then you kind of said doing the work, and I think that's really important, because what it seems like a major shift then is not just that these people do the traditional fan stuff of being telling your friends, rating, reviewing, buying the album, coming to the live show, even like the more intense fan stuff, like, coming to the Q&A, coming to the signing. But like you start having a new set of like social practices between fans to support artists' careers. And that seems like it's become increasingly important, not just like as a sideshow, but as like a central element in a successful career in recent years.
Yeah, I would say so. I'm trying to think. There was Amanda Palmer. You were asking for early adopters. Amanda Palmer is definitely one of the early ones for this as well.
With the crowdsourcing, yeah.
Yeah, with Kickstarter and an early Patreon proponent and user. And I find her fascinating because she's covered in this Douglas Rushkoff book called Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus. And it's a great book, but I kind of have a problem with how he talks about her and her fans, because he says she did this amazing project. She got this Kickstarter, got these millions, and then she went on tour and asked people to volunteer their services. She needed musicians to come and play with her. And she's like, I'll give you a beer and a hug. And that's it. And then fans got angry because they were like, well, we know you have money. We gave you money. We thought you were going to use it to, pay the people that work for you, not just like keep it. And he was framing it as like, oh, these are just naysayers giving her backlash. And I'm like, no, these are fans that are angry because they invested. And now they're seeing
financially.
Financially, emotionally, just the fact that this can backfire at some point seems to be ignored by everyone. Like if you're asking someone, like they'll call it the affect economy.
Yeah.
That term was used in Pitchfork in 2008. We have affective responses to music as a means of promotion is how they termed it. And then if you spend that much time, that much money, and then something just sort of backfires, you'll start to feel like, oh, I invested all of this and have nothing to show for it, because what you invested in was the product that you're not getting anything back except for the emotional reaction. Right.
So another huge part of this conversation, I'd be interested to hear your take, because again, when I think about the transition from Amanda Palmer and Lady Gaga, who while increasingly a major pop star, like the most times I have ever heard a song in a day was when Bad Romance was at the peak of its popularity, and I clocked it at 8. Like 8 times that day I heard Bad Romance. Like, so Gaga, like, I mean, huge cult fandom now, but that album, she had like 5 singles from it that were all hits. They were all pretty good.
Was that that you heard them all on the
No,
same?
out and about. Like, no, again, like I was in Ireland, so it's not that many radio stations, so it's possible like you're hearing it. Like, I heard it from a car, I heard it in a bar, I heard it in the bank, I heard it from my friend's computer, I heard it, right? Like, so some of those might have been, single sources might have been a result of some of those, but like, not all of them. It was wild. I was just like, I've spent like a not insignificant portion of my day hearing this song.
Yeah, yeah. I think the last time that happened to me was Ed Sheeran's "Shape of You." I could not avoid that song.
I mean, worst songs to have to hear a lot of times. I mean, I was like, go on, Ed Sheeran, make a dance hall banger, despite despite the odds. So I think a major part of that transition to like true of this kind of fan culture in the narratives about fan culture, maybe is a better way to say it. In the narratives about fan culture, in the broad discussion about fan culture among the media outlets and people who are not deeply knowledgeable about it, I think that the thing that helps us transition from this earlier moment of kind of big cult fan culture to everyone is a fan culture, everyone's a fan now, the thing that gets pointed to is K-pop as like a major set of innovators and like transmitters of fan practices. So I'd be really interested to hear your take on like K-pop and how it changed fan culture. And we've done some amazing episodes to explore like the depth of that specific fan culture, both globally. But I'm really interested to hear your take on like how it impacted fan culture outside of the like Hybeverse, basically.
It's fascinating because, and I haven't done as much digging on this as I probably could, probably because fellow friend Idolcast does such amazing work on this. But I noticed the K-pop stands and the J-pop stands in the mid 2000s as well on LiveJournal. Like they were super active. And when people at the time were talking about fan service and they're like, we don't know how we feel about the fan service, a lot of the K-pop fans would be like, oh, that's just the norm for us. Like fan service is part of the deal.
Right. It's a totally different. That's
this is
the thing.
Entire point of being a fan is to get like, oh, I like these two guys together. Give me more content of the two of them together.
Right.
And I think that's one example of how it really took off. And something that I and Kara have talked about is she says that the present day BTS K-pop fandom, a lot of it came from One Direction. And I do think that I think a lot of that is true. So
do you think One Direction is a major vector as well for like the expansion?
Yeah, because of the timing. Because they came out just when Twitter was just, gaining its feet, 2010. I always want to say that I'm open to more information because everything is so, widespread that it's hard to know unless you really researched it. But when I was looking into the American Idol stuff, it really looked like the start of using social media to reach fans and sort of tease ships and all of that. And that was exactly at the time where Twitter, they were celebrating contestants having like 10,000 followers. So that's the degree, like that's where Twitter was at the time. And the following year, which is also the year that One Direction were formed on the UK counterpart, because Simon Cowell was involved in both American Idol and
one of our most influential cultural figures. I'm looking forward to the eventual like deep dig biography of Simon Cowell.
You
gotta get out of the NDAs. We're not gonna get a good one for like another 75 years, but
no, there's a lot there. So and the following year in American Idol, they immediately were like, we need to have managed accounts for each contestant, right? So they got on that boat super quick. Meanwhile, in the UK, One Direction were using their Twitter to make fans, and they had video diaries. So it was very much this drive of like, look at us as people, like we're so cool and fun and cute, and we're best friends. In the early days, a lot of fans would say that they became fans with like video compilations that were like One Direction top 10 most funny moments, right?
Which is, again, that's very K-pop.
Yeah, so and I think they were kind of surprised by how well they were doing, and they didn't win X Factor. So
Mhm.
they didn't have the local UK, rabid fan base, but they had a global fan base that were
Mhm.
coming to them through Twitter,
Mhm.
through YouTube. And they were like, okay, great. So they're third. We still have the right to pick them up, which they
Mhm.
did. Cowell's Psycho company, which also owns a Psycho label, which no longer exists, which is fun. And, started to promote them as if they were, I was going to say a clothing brand, but that's just because that's what some of the people that were involved with the project, they're like, we're promoting a brand, we're treating them like a brand rather than musicians. And they were celebrating their first album is #1 in the US. And it's like, yeah, because of the fans. Like, it doesn't mean, wow, this album is amazing. It means that there's a groundswell of people trying to, you know, get them #1 and then
Right.
trying to trend things on Twitter. That was a very popular thing,
Mhm.
right? Yay, we got the top 10 trend on Twitter and people would celebrate it. And it's like, it feels ominous looking back because now it's just used by brands, shamelessly and just like trying to raise awareness. And people will, use hashtags in order to raise visibility for their content that has nothing to do with it, right?
Right.
And it's kind of just saying like a lot of people are talking about this.
There's something else because it seems like it's the sense that in a social media environment, that while the music is what people were buying for the most part, that these acts aren't just selling music anymore. And they're not just selling music. Musicians have not just been selling music for a really, really long time. I found this, me and my brother were listening to this old Aerosmith album. And what's fun is that the record sleeve has all the other Aerosmith stuff that you could buy. Like, these people have always been selling other stuff, but the sense that it was primarily music, and then you'd have ancillary profit streams around touring and gear, and early on, the Beatles, like TV shows, movies.
Beatles watch, they when they came to the US, there was like reports like they're in this city. This is that's an early update account.
Right, totally. But it does seem like what you're describing now is when you realize when you have the possibility of, because of social media, the set of relationships between these people in the band being the main thing that they're selling. And then the music as supporting that and all these other things as supporting that, and kind of decentering for a musical act, or an ostensibly musical act, decentering the music at least somewhat and centering the fandom and the fan communities and the relationships between the people, and then that being used to sell music. You're saying that people came to the fandom by watching videos of top 10 cutest moments. Also with YouTube views increasingly monetized on its own. And this sense that as you get into this multimedia environment, that music is one stream of content among a number, and that you can still build a career around primarily music and radio plays. That stuff really pays out. Streaming doesn't pay out, but radio play, if you're having a radio hit, still great.
Or
But
licensing it gets licensed for something.
yeah, sync we love sync. But that you can have a different business model as well, one that this other stuff that was previously secondary becomes primary in a new way.
Yeah, I just tapped away to find the screenshot. So the Sony leak in 2014, that was a Sony Pictures leak, not a Sony Music, but they still had some stuff to do with the music. And there were slides there for One Direction because One Direction have a documentary every year, basically, or
Right.
back then. So this was all about how to their little slides for each guy. These are the touch points. This is what they like this one's sporty. This one is preppy. These are the clothes we want them to wear. Super detailed. And then there's one slide that says, the music is not the only important brand touch point, but described by some fans as a bonus to the dynamic of the boys and access to more information about them. The ultimate quest of a directioner is to get closer to content about the boys. They use other brands other brand touch points to help.
Yeah, that's it. That's the ball game. So I guess so kind of building on that, and I think the newest, kind of pointing towards the future, if this is kind of where we've roughly been in increasingly intense ways. And certainly that describes Taylor Swift fandom in many ways. Swift, I think, is interesting because, as over discussed as she is, in that she moved from a musician to something that in towards this fandom in a different way. That really, I mean, there was this bizarre, I thought, New Yorker, not bizarre, but I thought very underthought and underbaked New Yorker piece about why music critics weren't writing about Taylor Swift correctly, that was published in the New Yorker, basically being like, you cannot like this album, but like that's not why she's important. And it's I think, I mean, at one level that's true, at another level it's like, but they're music critics and this is still ostensibly a musician. And also, though, that Taylor, in a way that's kind of unusual, made that transition from primarily being musical to being music plus, it feels like. And I feel like she did that over the pandemic, maybe a little bit before.
I think way before then.
I think that, well, she always had a dual, I mean, I guess I would argue, and I'd love to hear the counterpoint. I mean, my read on that is that, like, Taylor Swift is like the biggest cult act that's ever been. And what's interesting is that it seems to me is that Lover was her last attempt as being a traditional pop star, in that was the last time she had anything to do with like what the rest of pop music sounds like. That the pandemic era was a direct step away from that. The re-recording is a step away from that. And that it seems like that's when maybe the balance of some people always having that relationship with her, but also there being like a lot of people I know who just like liked Taylor Swift the way that they liked many musicians without any kind of real fandom, besides the fact that she's got a very distinctive personality in a lot of her records. And that then the fandom took over the overall trajectory. And then I know people who then had like Taylor Swift in one way. Then when the fandom exploded in popularity, then started to engage with her in this new other way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess it's a shift between the 1% to trying to expand it into a more, this is the normal / correct way to interact.
Yeah. Yes.
This is how you should be doing it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. In that sense, I definitely agree with you. I would say before, just because she used to be active on Tumblr. She used to have a Tumblr, and so a lot of the posts were, I mean, listen, these are blogs, so people are performative in that sense, but it was extra performative because it's like she could be watching right now. And they would call it Taylurking when like her account would like a post. They'd be like, she's lurking. Everyone, be on your best behavior. Like, watch out. She's watching us. And this is also how, and I don't know if this has changed since then because I'm not that invested in her business practices because they're so big now that I'm just like, and other people can look at it. But I know at the time she would have meet and greets and stuff like that, but you couldn't buy it. You couldn't buy a meet and greet pass. You would get a meet and greet by them singling you out. So people would post on Tumblr to be like, at Taylor Swift, I've been a fan since I was 10. My dying mother and I love you, yada, like this long thing. And then just hope that her or her mother would find this person and be like, you've been picked for a meet and greet.
Wild. That's wild.
Yeah. So, and obviously there's like, a whole bunch of meet and greets before the shows and after the shows. And they would often go into the crowd as well and pick people. I mean,
but I think that what you said before, that's bizarre and fascinating, or maybe extremely normal and fascinating.
It's very smart and fascinating, and definitely is kind of a through line to how you get.
Right. But I guess I'm really interested in something you said there that maybe kind of like pushes us towards like the last couple of topics I wanted to discuss, which is that you said that there was a change in the way you're supposed to interact with this person. And that to me strikes me, and I hadn't quite put that, I hadn't been able to articulate that before. And that sort of strikes me as something, as a longtime music fan, as something that's so different about this new crop of social spaces and context around which that's revolving around pop music. There has always been, like always, I think, and we kind of talked about this with Prince at the beginning, like there have always been fans of probably since the Beatles, since before, right? People, there's a small group of people who engage in this kind of fan practices, and this larger universe of people who engage, maybe touch on them, play with that fan idea, but also there's this other set of consumer practices and cultural practices about how to interact with this artist or that have other communities, right? And, you know, sometimes the balance shifts back and forth. I mean, I really like the Grateful Dead and know a lot about their history. And there were periods of time when like pre that fandom, and then the fandom took over, and then it changed again. And like you have these balances between like what percent of the audience is like fans and what percent of the audience are like people who are going to a rock show, maybe even people who are going to a rock show who like a couple of the Dead's albums, and that changes the experience. But it seems like if we say this has always been true, and there's always been varying percentages of fans around bands, it seems like the tenor very recently, I would say, has begun to fundamentally change, where you have these major acts where the normal accepted way to interact with them is through these fandom procedures and through these fandom cultures. And that strikes me as something that's fundamentally different.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you. And it's hard to sort of pinpoint where some of these changes happened, especially like I feel like I've been in it for so long that it's hard. And that's also why I started to write. I was like, I want to have some distance and sort of look at things from the outside and look at where, you know, where things changed. But yeah, I mean, the re-releases for Taylor is a great point. I mean, we saw this already with, you know, when Kanye, you know, came up on stage at the VMAs, I guess. And yeah, you know, it was like that created, that framed her as someone who needed to be defended. Right. And that's what a lot of fandom right now is, right? The fans are the armies that are representing you and are defending you and have your best interest at heart, quote unquote. But they really have the representation that they have in mind at heart. Yeah. I mean, that's been used. It really is a convergence of that, including the media. I think the media has been playing a big part in it, maybe because of the decline of the traditional media. And now they're like, the fans will click, they'll want to read this. They'll engage with our content if we write about this in the way that they want us to write about it. And then there's the fan journalists who just cover their idols the way that they want to cover them. And that has always been a thing as well with the industry, where content and access can be withheld if you're not covering them the way that they want to be covered, right?
Right.
And I think that's an even bigger problem now, because not only might you get cut off from the source, but you might get attacked by the fans. So it becomes a much more beige way of approaching everything, because it's kind of all the same. Like, this is brilliant, this is game changing, revolutionary, and you're like,
I mean, so it strikes me that this might be to a certain extent a result of changing political economies. That what you get for the first time more recently is a sense that, partially as a result of metrics, partially as a result of changing payout structures, is that, as we said kind of in the beginning, that instead of trying to sell everyone a $15 CD, because everyone's not buying a $15 CD, you can get that kind of money, though, if you can get 100,000 people to buy a $25 vinyl record. Like, that there's ways to redistribute attention around the people who are actually going to pay you out money. And that's where I wanted to kind of get to what we're starting to see, which is like the platformization of fan culture, and this idea that, or this reality that there's increasingly spaces of online specialty platforms designed to take the set of social activities and energies that fans have been producing and basically bring them inside the walled garden and really start charging for them, which seems like it threatens like a fundamental change to fan culture and how it's operated.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I haven't been on Weverse, which is the Hybe platform that allows for direct contact with the idols, or quote unquote direct contact. Like you can pay to get direct messages with them, and I'm like, I mean, sure, they're messaging you, of course they are. What I've noticed as well is when Pop Crave on Twitter covers something that comes from Weverse, the stands get really angry and they're like, this is for us, this is our content. You have no right to take this and show it to the rest of the world. Like, this is our garden. Like, this is an intimate moment between, this is our intimacy that you're sullying by sharing it with the world. And it's like, that is fascinating. And it's wild. And I looked at there's so many different platforms now. I don't even know all of them. But one I looked at recently is called Fave. And it doesn't cost to join, but the entire purpose of it is to verify your fandom. So you can be a verified fan or a verified super fan. And, the higher you are on that scale, the more, they're saying the more perks you have, but the only perks I could find were like, oh, here's a pop-up shop with merch, I'm like, is it a perk that I get to spend more money? Like,
yes. I mean, right. According to, I have friends who like pay to get on the fan club list so that they can buy tickets. Like, yes, buying stuff is definitely a perk.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it is. It's just for me, I still find it so strange. I think also because I come from a fan culture where you could be poor and, express your fandom in different ways and, make your own merch. Like, that would be fine. No one would be like, you're taking money away from them by creating your own merch. And I don't know, just I was gonna say it's not monetizing. It's attributing points to activity is like gamification in a way that I find upsetting.
Well, yeah. I mean, it also suggests that, in a way I could imagine being very upsetting, that like this space that was initially maybe not a reaction to, but certainly like outside of the traditional structures of popularity, is like now not just within them, but like entirely bought in. Like, it didn't, like, if we think back to that initial where some of these fandom structures come from, like, no one was mad. People were mad that Firefly got canceled, but no one was mad that like Buffy wasn't the biggest show in America. It wasn't supposed to be. They wanted to be successful, but like, it's okay that like the topic of your fandom isn't for everyone. If it's for everyone, then why aren't you like a Yankees fan? Like,
yeah, just watch ER. Watch Seventh Heaven was the #1 show on WB for like its whole run. No one talks about Seventh Heaven these days, but it was the biggest show,
it's true. No one does talk about Seventh.
I mean, it did not stand the test of time, but I guess it really, I don't know what the audience was for it, but it was the #1 show. And I think you could say about like ER was #1. Like, there was a lot of shows that were #1 that we don't even think about.
Right.
So it's like, but that is interesting that you mentioned even just like ratings and stuff like that. Because as someone who was involved in TV fandom and now works in television, what would happen a lot of the time is if a show was, quote unquote, on the bubble, fans would rally and be like, you have to watch it, tell your friends to watch it, make sure. And what's interesting is, and I didn't know this at the time, is like, oh, that's not how ratings work. If you don't have a Nielsen meter, like if you don't have a meter that is measuring your viewing, your view doesn't count. So I would have on the TV to make sure it was there, and have on the TV during the repeats, and be like, please count my views, and telling people, please just you don't even have to watch it, just turn it on. And it's like, this is not being measured
directly in any way. Well, I mean, it's also, and this is something that Saxon and I talk a lot about. That's fascinating. Is the ways in which like we're not just like a consumer democracy, but it's like the like consumption as democracy, right? This idea that like buying or consuming is a vote, and that it doesn't. I can't help but think that like as people are disconnected from political systems that seem incurably ossified, like politics is struggling to change people's lives much. I mean, like directly in way, like their ability to exert forces on politics that let them change their lives is like people don't feel that very frequently. And so, like one reaction to that is things like protests, and another reaction to that is like there's spaces where my vote does count, except it's not quite a vote. It's your dollars, and like yes, they do count, but it's different. And I think it's some of the feeling that like your dollar should count, right? There's something funny and relationship to an imagined political ideal there.
Yeah. I mean, for some reason, we think spending is going to, like, this is what I experienced in One Direction fandom, is there would be these fan projects to get specific songs out there, just to be like, listen, guys, this isn't just a joke band, that children like. This is a real band. This is good music. You should be into it. Look at our power. Like, we got this song on the radio. We got this song to win something. Except, that didn't increase the respectability at all. I mean, I'm sure it made for great headlines and good PR, papers collected by the publicity firms being like, look at this. But it didn't really do anything.
Though in that regard, I wonder if it was just a little bit too early. Like in a post-critical world, in a post-poptimism world, right? Like this sense of like there's nothing else. Increasingly, it feels like there's in large swaths of the pop ecosystem, there's who sells the most, and that's sort of it. And there's no, I mean, for many reasons, good and bad, a sense of like a position from which you can exert critical, not objectivity, but like critical perspective has abandoned, in which case you just have competing bubbles. And who's to say that like the biggest bubble isn't the best bubble?
I mean, it's true what you're saying. Who sells the most can be seen as, you can get a headline from that. But what's interesting is there isn't always a headline. And also there's this stuff where you need to have X amount of units for, gold or platinum or silver. So fans will be counting until you get to that number. And they're like, we did it. This happened. Okay, where's the plaque? And then it's like, oh no, the label has to apply for that. And if they don't do it, then it doesn't matter. Like you can't write a press release to Billboard, be like, hey, we accomplished this sales figure. So technically they've got gold. Because it's like, well, where's the certification? It's like, well, they haven't applied for it yet. Then it's like, well, then we don't care. This is irrelevant. So a lot of those numbers get carried and bandied about by the fans, but it doesn't really transfer anywhere else. So there's an example of Rihanna, who I think this was Anti, I could be wrong, which immediately upon release was platinum.
Sure.
Immediately. And it was like, wow, that's amazing. And then you poke around a little bit and you scratch the tiniest amount. You don't even have to look very far. You just scratch a little bit and you're like, oh, there was a deal with Samsung that they would receive 1 million copies to distribute to their customers. So that right away is 1 million. That's it. You have you're platinum now. Has nothing to do with the fan demand, which Rihanna is a massive artist. Like there's no doubting that, but just that particular achievement was, constructed essentially. And Jay-Z had done the same because she was still with his,
he was Rock Nation or he was Def Jam at that point. Yeah.
Yeah. So she was still under his umbrella, if you will. Ha 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 ha. And even that song, there's been some great pieces about how they made it a hit. And you could easily listen to it and be like, yeah, it's super catchy. Of course it's a hit, but just the way that it was rolled out across radio, which, was much more important, when that came out, and how it was like, well, it needs to be, it has to be played this many times by iHeart in each market, so that it gets heard this many times, so that people get used to it and start liking it. And then just, make sure you blast it out as much as possible. Like it's not an organic, quote unquote. And what does organic mean these days?
That's a tale as old as time. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk today. This was incredibly informative and head spinning and concerning and fascinating, all in equal measures.